From the most successful movie franchise on Earth to unfortunately being relegated to a hit or miss TV show on a corporate streaming service, Star Wars is one of the most tragic franchises of all time. It almost parallels Anakin's story arc. The lightning in a bottle which was Star Wars' success is something that future generations will likely never get to experience, and this can be chalked up to multiple factors. Most people will simply blame Disney and mismanagement, which definitely is a factor, but for someone like me, I'm more interested in the why. Why has Star Wars seemingly lost its spark? Why are stories still focused on the era of the Galactic Empire? Why can't anyone post Revenge of the Sith use a lightsaber correctly? These are all important questions that are in need of answers, which is what I want to do with this analysis. In this analysis, I'll be going through the major sections of the Star Wars universe, which includes the movies, TV shows, games, and novels, and I'll be giving my own critique and viewpoint of the franchise as it is currently. This will include an informative outline of the corporate timeline of events, as well as mentions of intent from each of the parties involved. This includes George Lucas as well. To be clear on this point, this doesn't mean that I'm going to provide a biased agenda based on the party that is being analysed. For example, Disney again is just easy to outright blame. Simply, any areas of intent which could have changed the direction of the series internally, or even from our side as the fans, will be mentioned, as I believe they are important in painting the picture of how Star Wars got to where it is today. To understand why Star Wars is where it is today, we first need to look at what made it special in the first place. During the George Lucas era, Star Wars wasn't just a collection of movies, it was a cultural phenomenon. From the groundbreaking original trilogy to the expanded universe of novels, games, and animated series, Star Wars captured the imaginations of generations. The franchise built a rich universe that felt lived in, mythic, and timeless. Even when the prequel trilogy arrived, with all of its divisiveness, it introduced iconic characters, complex political themes, and laid the groundwork for an even larger universe. That said, the George Lucas era wasn't perfect. While some of the flaws of the prequels like wooden dialogue, awkward pacing, and overuse of early CGI were heavily criticized at the time, the long-term legacy of that era has grown more positive. Honestly though, in my opinion, the CGI was needed because Yoda was looking washed already. Still, it's important to acknowledge those initial flaws without diving in too deeply just yet. Despite that rocky reception, Star Wars never lost momentum. If anything, it surged in popularity after the prequels thanks to a string of successful games like The Force Unleashed, Battlefront, and Knights of the Old Republic, along with beloved shows like The Clone Wars. The franchise remained the most valuable IP on Earth, and naturally fans began to ask when the sequel trilogy would arrive. As it turns out, George Lucas had already written a basic outline for it, but unfortunately, that version would never come to life. On October 30th, 2012, George Lucas sold Lucasfilm to Disney CEO Bob Iger. Lucas has cited the desire to step back from the intense demands of filmmaking and trusted Disney to continue his vision. At the time, Iger assured Lucas that his story treatments for the sequels would be taken into account. But as history shows, Disney quickly charted its own course, a direction that led to The Force Awakens. Upon release, The Force Awakens was seen as a return to form. It revived the wonder of Star Wars for older fans and introduced the galaxy to a new generation. It sparked enormous hype and expectations soared for Episode 8. Along the way, Disney released Rogue One, a gritty, grounded war story that was largely well received, which further reinforced the direction that Disney was taking and, as we know, later led to one of the most successful spin-offs in the Disney era. But then came The Last Jedi, the film that would fracture the fanbase. While some appreciated its bold narrative risks and subversion of expectations, others saw it as a rejection of core Star Wars values. It became the most polarizing entry in the franchise, and its impact was immediate. The fallout led to the rise of Skywalker, a rushed, chaotic attempt to close the trilogy while undoing much of what had come before. With an overstuffed plot, questionable story decisions, and clear signs of a lack of long-term planning, Episode 9 marked a clear turning point. It wasn't just the end of the sequel trilogy, it was the moment many fans began to feel that the magic was truly gone. Now that the overview is done, I'm going to go in depth with each of these films and how they've affected the legacy of Star Wars. And we're actually going to go backwards, starting with the sequel trilogy, as that's definitely the most controversial era. Episode 7, The Force Awakens, as stated before, was originally a well-liked movie, until the rest of the sequel trilogy concluded. Honestly, I don't like this revisionist history of saying Episode 7 was bad because everyone loved it. I mean, there was a few people, but you know. It tells a story that parallels the events of A New Hope with a new protagonist in Rey Skywalker. Rey, who starts off as a humble scavenger that eventually progresses into a promising Force user with a strong affinity to the prior crew that saved the galaxy from the Empire. Now, Rey as a whole in this movie is a very inoffensive character who is clearly meant to be this generation's Luke Skywalker. This is why you could argue that the plot point of finding Luke was meant to correspond to Rey's development as a light side Force user, which I could go more in depth with as an idea, as it could be an explanation as to why Luke was portrayed the way he was in The Last Jedi, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Throughout the movie, she is hinted to have broader importance to the Star Wars universe, as again the original trilogy characters treat her like family, even though they met her less than a couple of days ago. Anakin's lightsaber, which somehow returned after being lost in Episode 5, calls out to her, hinting at a potential familial connection, and Kylo Ren even talks about her with lots of importance and even tries desperately to capture her, which is saying a lot, especially since he's a crash out that has daddy issues. The reason why this was done narratively was due to J.J. Abrams' mystery box method, which was utilized for two reasons. One, it meant that the audience would be more intrigued by the questions presented in the film, which would drive hype up for the second film in the trilogy. And two, J.J. Abrams was not set to direct Episode 8 and Episodes 9 at the time of The Force Awakens release. Yes, they walked into the trilogy with absolutely no plan. By leaving the questions regarding Rey unresolved, this allowed any writers and directors to come in after him and fill in the blanks, which honestly was a bulletproof plan that couldn't possibly go wrong. The last thing that I guess I couldn't mention with Rey is her power in this film, which some people may have issues with, which I'll also get into in a sec, but honestly, disregarding everything that came after, it doesn't jump the shark, as she's fairly in line with someone who would be considered a gifted Force user. Moving on from Rey, we have to discuss another important character in this trilogy, who we will be going more in depth on later on in FN 2187, or Finn. Finn honestly has one of the most interesting character introductions in the whole of Star Wars. To give some context, the First Order, who is essentially the villains of this trilogy, which again I'll discuss later, indoctrinates their soldiers by kidnapping them as kids and brainwashing them. Finn is one of those soldiers that ends up defecting to the Resistance and teams up with Han Solo and Chewbacca alongside Rey. This plot point is so interesting as it gives many implications for the future of the story, such as the potential scarcity of deserters, the morality of harming these brainwashed soldiers, and the potential Force sensitivity of Finn, which is also explored later on in the film. The reason why I'm mentioning Finn's Force sensitivity is because it's implied that the Force awakened within Finn, which also ties in with the title of Episode 7. In the first few moments of the film, Finn clearly breaks out of his brainwashing by refusing to shoot unarmed villagers, which also grabs Kylo Ren's attention for a slight moment. Effectively, Finn sets a lot of the events in motion by helping Poe Dameron escape the First Order, which leads to him landing on Jakku and finding Rey and BB-8. This, at least to me, tells us the audience that Finn going forward is going to have a vital part to play. Slightly off topic, but I want to quickly go over Poe's character as there isn't much to say about him in this film. Essentially, he's just treated as the high-ranking ace pilot of the Resistance, but that's as far as his actual importance goes. Bringing it back to Finn, throughout the film he talks about escaping the First Order and leaving the fight between them and the Resistance, which builds up the threat that the First Order presents, and it hints to a level of trauma that Finn has built up due to being a soldier for them. However, he ends up staying to protect his newfound friends due to the circumstances that happened in Takodana, which leads to a skirmish between them and the First Order. Finn starts using Anakin's lightsaber here, which is significant in terms of Force potential, as supplementary material has made it very clear that a lightsaber is incredibly hard to use for non-Force sensitive people. During this skirmish, Rey gets kidnapped by Kylo Ren, which led to the events of the rescue at Starkiller Base. Again, Finn picks up the lightsaber to fight Kylo Ren to protect Rey, and surprisingly again does well despite the lack of training, but he ends up falling to Kylo. All of this points to a potential Jedi training arc in the later movies, but as you guys already know by now, that is only a fantasy. Lastly for Finn, I do want to mention his relationship with Rey, which I'll have more to say when we get to the later movies, but it's implied that there is a romantic interest on Finn's side, which could have been explored, but again, these were plot points built into this movie which change in the later ones. Since I've mentioned him a lot, the next character I'll be talking about is Ben Solo, or better known as Kylo Ren, who again shows a lot of potential in this movie to be a great villain. He is clearly meant to be a knockoff Darth Vader, which is shown through his attire, family lineage, and his admiration of the fallen Sith Lord. However, he is given many of the flaws that Anakin had, such as his anger and recklessness, which makes this character a weirdly intriguing hybrid of one of the best cinema villains of all time. Throughout the movie, they point out his desperate attempts to mimic his grandfather, with the main ones being when Rey read his mind and discovers his insecurity of not being as strong as Darth Vader. Bro even pillow talks to his melted mask, begging it for power. It shows that Kylo is much more human than Vader, and subtly it reinforces the potential return to the light side, as Kylo doesn't seem as committed or evil towards the dark side of the Force, which fans know would also make him weaker. Kylo even ends up killing Han Solo, his father, to convince himself that he's committed to the dark side, but even when he did it, he was hesitating, and we get to see the internal struggle through the cinematography and performance that Kylo is experiencing. Now, some people do feel as if Han Solo's death here was pointless and a wasted opportunity, as they had the perfect opportunity to reunite the old cast if they kept him alive past episode 7. With the context of the later films, these people are correct simply because the direction those films took would have heavily benefited from Han Solo's involvement. However, during the time of this film's release, if the next film went in a different direction, this death would have given the original crew a major reason to have a reunion and stop the First Order. It also finally let Harrison Ford vote this character, as he vocally stated he hated this character. Shortly after, this is when Kylo duels both Finn and then Rey while injured due to being hit by Chewbacca's bowcaster. Once he defeated Finn, he attempted to recover Anakin's lightsaber using the Force, but the saber rejects him and goes straight to Rey, who is also reaching out for it using the Force. During this scene, the Skywalker theme plays once Rey retrieves the weapon, which again hints to a familial connection that is so blatant that it's impressive that the later films remix her background so much. This scene and the entire fight again was very promising, as it showed clear gaps in Kylo's power and maturity, which were things that could have been remedied from on and off screen development leading into and during the next film. The last couple of things I want to touch on regarding Kylo Ren are, for 1, the Knights of Ren, 2, Snoke, and 3, the helmet. Now then, the Knights of Ren are introduced as Kylo Ren's personal enforcers, as he's described as the master of the Knights of Ren. It sets up a group of potential Force wielders that could be used for more world building in later films, but throughout the trilogy they are wasted. Snoke, who is such a hard character to speak about in hindsight, is the supreme leader of the First Order. He's meant to take on the Emperor role and is the master of Kylo. Surprisingly, at least how it's mentioned in this movie, Snoke and Kylo aren't technically Sith, which is why I haven't mentioned them as such. Snoke was described as an ancient dark side wielder who was incredibly powerful, and his characterization and design supported this idea. So much wasted potential. Finally, the idea of Ben communicating with Vader's mask is actually really interesting, especially when you consider that Vader turned back to the light and became a Force ghost before he died. It could have implied a few things, like maybe there's a split between the light of Anakin and the darkness of Vader, something we never really got to explore at the end of Return of the Jedi. It also lines up with the idea that the Sith, when they die, sometimes haunt objects that they were attached to, so maybe Vader's rage and power are still lingering in the helmet. That would have been a cool concept, the idea that Vader never fully left the suit behind, even if Anakin was redeemed. Of course, the canon explanation is that Ben was just being manipulated by Snoke the whole time, which, yeah, is cleaner, but nowhere near as interesting. You could argue it kind of mirrors the whole Anakin dream stuff from Revenge of the Sith, but again, that's me getting ahead of myself. Next up, I want to talk about the original trilogy characters, starting with Han Solo, who alongside Chewie are the most prominent original trilogy characters in the film. Han plays the role of the mentor figure for Finn and Rey, and is described as the father that Rey never had by Kylo, which he found out during the mind reading scene. In my opinion, I feel like he fulfills his role perfectly, and it creates more intrigue as to the rift between Han and Kylo. On screen, we see the hero from the original trilogy, but as we know from his return to smuggling, it seems almost like Han has regressed back to how he was in A New Hope. However, by the way he interacts with our new protagonist, and even by the way he speaks about the Force, we can tell Han has matured and is still the hero we now know him to be. Some people do have issues with him seemingly regressing back to who he was, but if you put it in context, it does make a whole lot more sense. Prior to the events of the film, Luke Skywalker was training Kylo alongside his new Jedi, but as we know, Kylo ended up betraying Luke and destroying his new Jedi. This allegedly caused Luke to disappear in the first place out of guilt, but as you could guess, that guilt wasn't taken solely by Luke. This is a bit of an assumption, but Han and Leia likely were feeling guilty and experiencing a great deal of sorrow because of the situation. Leia dealt with it by helping out the Resistance, whereas Han dealt with it by going back to the only thing he was good at. I like the juxtaposition of Han's character clearly progressing as a human being, but regressing back to his old career path, which got him in much trouble in the past. You could argue that Han leaving Leia is out of character, but again, people deal with grief and depression in different ways. To argue that they weren't distraught by the fact that their son had taken the same path as his grandfather, I feel like would be unrealistic. Also, Han saying that he's only good at smuggling could imply multiple things about how he views himself, such as he may believe that he's a bad father or he can't do anything good as he's just a smuggler who got lucky. I might be looking too deep into this, but these are ideas I hope that the writing team were trying to convey. The second original trilogy character I want to briefly mention, since she was already mentioned, is Leia. She plays a small role in this movie and is mostly a representation of good as the leader of the Resistance. She's relatively the same as how we saw her in the original trilogy, so there isn't much to say about her in terms of plot or progression. The same can be said about Chewbacca, the droids, and Luke, as the former haven't changed much, and the latter isn't in the film longer than 10 seconds. I guess the only thing that is weird with the original trilogy characters is that when they return from Starkiller Base, Leia knows that Han had passed, but rather than embracing Chewie, his best friend, she comforts the girl she's only just met that had only met Han maybe a couple of days ago, and that's stretching it. It's probably closer to a couple of hours ago. Lastly, I want to explain the plot. Yeah, I know this seems counterintuitive, but as we all know, The Force Awakens is essentially just A New Hope remixed. Moreover, there isn't much that happens in this film that foreshadows or directly impacts the next film or the Star Wars universe. This retroactively becomes a problem as it leaves The Force Awakens in an awkward spot where it doesn't push the world of Star Wars forward from where it was left in the original trilogy. The First Order and Resistance are just rebranded versions of the Empire and Rebels, which almost makes us feel as if the original trilogy was pointless as Luke didn't restore peace to the galaxy. In truth, this film is essentially a soft reboot of the series for younger audiences and an introduction to these characters and their motivations. This isn't entirely bad as it introduces ideas that can be easily built upon, but as you shall soon see, a sequel without the same vision as its predecessors can prove to be extremely detrimental to the future of a series.